Trump makes huge announcement on oil in Venezuela. And what you really need to know, Trump's declaration wasn't just another press release. It was a seismic policy pivot, one that promises to reshape global energy markets, realign geopolitical alliances, and test the limits of American economic power. On January 6, 2026, President Donald Trump announced that Venezuela's interim leadership will turn over between 30 million and 50 million barrels of high-quality sanctioned oil to the United States, and that the U.S. will control and sell that oil at market prices, with the proceeds used to benefit the people of Venezuela and the United States. On television, the moment was framed as decisive, historic, even triumphant. But beneath the applause lines and geopolitical ambition sits a much harder question. Not whether the oil exists, not whether the United States can physically move it, but whether this announcement changes the system it's meant to control, or whether the system simply adapts around it, the way it always does. Because removing a leader, seizing an asset, or announcing a deal has never been the same thing as reshaping the forces that made those assets matter in the first place. And Venezuela, more than almost any other country, has become a test case for that reality. On the surface, the numbers sound impressive. 30 to 50 million barrels of oil, tankers headed north, refineries in Houston and Louisiana designed precisely for this kind of heavy, sour crude. A political narrative that ties energy security, consumer relief, and geopolitical realignment into one clean story. But in the context of the global oil market, those barrels are not a flood. The world consumes roughly 100 to 103 million barrels per day. The United States alone consumes around 19 million barrels per day. Even at the high end, 50 million barrels represents just a few days of global supply. This isn't a volume play, it's a signal. And signals matter not because of what they deliver immediately, but because of what markets believe they imply about the future. That's where the real story begins. The announcement wasn't just about oil flowing from Venezuela to the United States. It was about reopening a market that has been effectively closed, mismanaged, and weaponized for more than 2 decades. It was about testing whether Venezuela could be pulled back into an American-aligned energy orbit. And most importantly, it was about whether Washington could use a combination of force, leverage, and promises to rewire the geopolitical energy map, at a moment when that map is already being redrawn by China, Russia, and Iran. The president made that clear, even if indirectly. The message delivered to Venezuela's interim leadership was blunt. Pumping more oil would require kicking out adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, and doing business with the United States instead. That condition transforms this from an energy deal into a geopolitical ultimatum. And ultimatums don't exist in a vacuum. They interact with incentives, infrastructure, risk, and profit, which is where the neatness of the announcement begins to unravel, because capital doesn't respond to speeches. It responds to margins, risk, and enforceability. Yes, U.S. refiners are uniquely suited to process Venezuelan heavy crude. Yes, refineries along the Gulf Coast were built for exactly this type of oil back when Venezuela was a reliable supplier. And yes, energy executives understand the reserves, the geology, and the long-term potential. Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips. These companies have decades of institutional memory in Venezuela. But institutional memory cuts both ways. They remember not just the oil, but the expropriations, the contract disputes, the infrastructure collapse, the security risks, the political volatility. And that memory is shaping how this announcement is being received in boardrooms, not just newsrooms. Because while politicians talk in terms of opportunity, corporations talk in terms of guarantees. And right now, Venezuela offers very few of them. The oil infrastructure inside the country is severely degraded. Years of underinvestment, mismanagement, and sanctions have left pipelines corroded, ports unreliable, and production capacity far below its theoretical potential. Getting oil out of the ground is only the first step. Getting it safely to market requires functioning logistics, stable governance, enforceable contracts, insurance coverage, and worker security. These are not abstract concerns. They are line items. And without clear answers, capital waits. That's why the announcement of 30 to 50 million barrels matters less than what follows it. Because the oil being turned over now does not automatically translate into sustained production later. And without sustained production, the geopolitical leverage Washington is aiming for remains fragile. This is where the pattern from previous sanctions campaigns becomes relevant again. When sanctions tighten, markets don't stop. They reroute. When one supplier becomes risky or unavailable, buyers don't abandon demand. They substitute supply. That dynamic has played out repeatedly from Iran to Russia to Venezuela itself. And the danger for Washington is that this announcement, if not followed by structural stability, risks repeating the same cycle in reverse. A brief surge of control, followed by adaptation elsewhere. Consider what happens if U.S. companies hesitate, delay, or scale back investment because security and legal clarity don't materialize fast enough. Venezuelan production remains constrained, global supply remains tight, and buyers who were once expected to be shut out simply continue sourcing oil from other sanctioned producers. Iran, Russia, shadow fleets, discounted barrels moving through opaque channels. The flow continues. Only the labels change. That's the sanctions paradox policymakers keep running into. Pressure doesn't eliminate trade. It reorganizes it. And that reorganization carries consequences that rarely appear in press releases. Because when oil revenues shift, so does power. Iranian oil revenue doesn't just support domestic budgets. It funds military programs, proxy networks, and strategic leverage across the Middle East. Russian energy exports don't just pay for pipelines. They subsidize geopolitical defiance. Every barrel rerouted away from one system strengthens another. And that's the strategic risk embedded in any energy maneuver that doesn't fully account for market elasticity. The Trump administration understands this, which is why this announcement is being framed not as a one-off transaction, but as the opening move in a larger realignment. The vision, as articulated by former Energy Secretary Dan Brouillette, is ambitious. A Western Hemisphere energy bloc. Venezuela reopened, Brazil's reserves integrated, U.S. refining capacity optimized. A counterweight to China's expanding energy footprint. On paper, it's coherent. Strategically, it's elegant. But execution lives in the details, and the details are where systems push back. Because geopolitical strategy can propose alliances faster than economies can absorb them. Latin America's response offers a preview of that friction. Regional leaders are watching carefully. Some see opportunity, others see precedent. Coordinated statements from countries like Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Uruguay, and Spain signal unease, not necessarily opposition, but resistance to unilateral action. Sovereignty matters. And energy, more than almost any other resource, sits at the intersection of sovereignty and dependency. The more forcefully Washington asserts control, the more carefully regional actors calculate their autonomy. Europe's response is more muted, but not enthusiastic. Support framed through concern, emphasis on stability, warnings about escalation. And behind it all, a familiar constraint, dependence on U.S. security. Europe can criticize, but it can't confront, which leaves the United States in a familiar position, powerful, but increasingly isolated in decision-making. China, Russia, and Iran see something else entirely. Not a stabilized market, but an opportunity to observe how far U.S. leverage really extends. How durable its control mechanisms are, how quickly markets adapt when pressure is applied. Because for them, Venezuela isn't just a country, it's a case study. And that's why this announcement matters beyond oil prices. Domestically, the effects will not be immediate. Gas prices won't collapse overnight. The addition of a few days' worth of supply doesn't move global benchmarks in isolation, but signals shape expectations. Expectations shape investment, and investment shapes long-term supply. If markets believe Venezuelan oil is truly reopening under stable, U.S.-aligned conditions, that belief alone can influence futures pricing, refinery planning, and capital flows. If they don't, the announcement fades into noise. That uncertainty is why executives are cautious, not defiant, not dismissive, just careful. They are weighing opportunity against risk in a country that has burned investors repeatedly over the past 25 years. And no amount of political urgency can erase that memory. This creates a quiet tension at the heart of the strategy. The White House needs momentum. The market needs proof. And until those two timelines align, the system remains unstable. Meanwhile, the broader costs accumulate. Military deployments to enforce sanctions, naval patrols, intelligence operations, insurance premiums for shipping. Each action designed to project control adds friction to global trade. That friction gets priced in, not loudly, gradually, through higher costs, volatility, and complexity. Consumers don't feel it all at once. They feel it over time in unpredictability, in higher baseline prices, in fiscal strain. And hovering over all of this is the slow erosion of dollar dominance. Every time countries restructure trade to avoid U.S.-controlled systems, even marginally, the foundation shifts. Not overnight, over decades. But those shifts matter. Because dollar dominance isn't symbolic. It's functional. It allows the United States to borrow cheaply, run deficits, and absorb shocks that would cripple other economies. When that advantage weakens, policy choices become more constrained at home. That's the irony embedded in announcements like this one. They are framed as protecting American interests, but the system they operate within is less forgiving than the rhetoric suggests. If the strategy strengthens rivals elsewhere, alienates partners, and accelerates alternative trade networks, the net effect becomes ambiguous. So, what did this announcement actually accomplish? It demonstrated intent, it tested leverage, it signaled ambition, it put pressure on Venezuela's interim leadership. It reassured U.S. refiners that Washington wants them back in the game. And it told adversaries that the United States is still willing to act decisively in energy politics. But it did not resolve the core challenge. The challenge isn't accessing oil, it's controlling flows in a market that no longer centralizes control. It's sustaining influence without triggering adaptation. It's aligning political timelines with economic realities. This was not a failure in the tactical sense. Oil will move, deals will be explored, talks will continue, but strategically, the outcome remains undecided. Because markets are already stress-testing the announcement, capital is already calculating risk, and rival systems are already preparing contingencies. Venezuela is not the end of this story. It's the opening chapter of a larger one. A story about how power operates in a fragmented world. About how economic pressure collides with globalized trade. About how announcements compete with incentives. And about how the balance between markets and states continues to shift, often quietly, often invisibly, until the consequences are undeniable. The operation continues. The negotiations proceed. The oil waits. And the question lingers beneath every headline. If controlling a resource doesn't control the system that distributes it, what exactly does power look like now? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, and that's precisely why it matters.